Assad unleashes chemical weapons on his own civilians. We talk about the overreach of government and California's Prop 65, and a little note about Tasmanian devils. This is Vong, and this is A Civil Moment.
I'd like to begin by condemning the heinous attack on innocent Syrians with banned chemical weapons. It was an atrocious attack. It was horrible. You don't see things like that, as bad as the news is around the world. You just don't see those images. We are studying that situation extremely closely. We are meeting with our military and everybody else. And we'll be making some major decisions over the next 24 to 48 hours. We are very concerned when a thing like that can happen. This is about humanity. We're talking about humanity. And it can't be allowed to happen. If it's Russia, if it's Syria, if it's Iran, if it's all of them together, we'll figure it out. And we'll know the answers quite soon.
That's President Trump responding to reports of the chemical weapons attack that happened in Syria over the weekend. In its current civil war in Syria, Bashar al-Assad's regime has had a dark history with chemical weapons. Back in August of 2013, Assad's forces launched a chemical weapons attack that killed 1,400, including many civilians, among them women and small children. This was just several months after President Obama said that chemical weapons would be, quote, crossing a red line. By September of that year, the United States and Russia had reached an agreement that called for Syria's arsenal of chemical weapons to be removed or destroyed by the middle of 2014. By April of 2014, however, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons said in a statement that it had collected evidence that chlorine had been used as a weapon, quote, systematically and repeatedly in 3 villages in northern Syria in April. And a United Nations report also said that chemical attacks had taken place in both April and May. Then again in the spring of 2015, 2 years after Bashar al-Assad agreed to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons stockpile, the regime was accused of dropping barrels of chlorine bombs out of helicopters in the town of Sarmin. Then in August of 2015, a mustard gas attack. And then in September of 2016, a chlorine gas attack. And then in April of 2017, a sarin attack that prompted President Trump to order a military strike that fired 59 Tomahawk missiles at the Al-Sharat airfield where the chemical weapons attack had originated. And now just a few days ago, in April of 2018, we have yet another chemical agent attack, the chemicals themselves not yet identified, that has resulted in the horrific and unbelievably sad pictures of children along with men and women who have perished. Last count of at least 49 dead. The Syrians are braced for some kind of reprisal. And in fact, in the pre-dawn hours of Monday morning, missiles struck the T4 airbase in the province of Homs. The Syrians first accused the United States of being the aggressor, but after the Pentagon denied it, the Syrian and Russians have since shifted their blame to Israeli forces. And the Israelis themselves are neither confirming nor denying that they were responsible for the attack they most likely carried out. Iran's Fars news agency said that 4 Iranians were among the at least 14 people reportedly killed at the base, which also houses Russians and members of the Lebanese Hezbollah militia. The fact that Israeli forces attacked an airbase that was the base of operations for Hezbollah, Iranians, Russians, and Syrians should be very concerning. You have the interests of the Jordanians, the interests of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the interests of the Egyptians. The Israeli response risks a regional conflict that could explode into a major area of concern, not just for the United States and not just for the Middle East, but potentially the entire world. Trump is already calling Assad, quote, animal Assad in his tweets. And his Homeland Security advisor, Tom Bossert, has told ABC News that, quote, nothing is off the table. What does that mean? In 2015, it looked like Assad was on his way out. But thanks to support from the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah, it appears now as if Assad's government will continue to rule. And while we cannot foresee an imminent cessation to the staggering amounts of violence that will continue on for many more years in Syria, the ramifications and repercussions of the war are already having significant effects throughout the world and not just in the local region. Syrian refugees have flooded into Europe and Canada as well as the United States. And unfortunately, along with those refugees, you have individuals who have been radicalized and who are intent on doing harm to their new host nations. And as much as it would be in the United States' best interest to see a Syria without Bashar al-Assad, the reality is that entire country and that entire conflict has become a proxy war where on the one side you have the United States and its military allies and Israel, and on the other side you have adversaries such as Russia, Iran, and an increasingly autocratic Turkey. And like every complicated geopolitical situation, nothing is black and white. It is hopelessly naive to believe that on the one side you have Assad and his allies, and on the other side some semblance of a rebellion that should be supported, especially up until only several months ago. A major component of that rebellion consisted of people such as ISIS. And while ISIS continues to lose territory, some of the vacuum that is being formed is being filled by people not much ideologically different than ISIS. And we should very well take heed of the lessons to be learned in the Middle East, lest we find ourselves repeating the mistakes of our recent history, where we armed Saddam Hussein only to find him pointing those same weapons at our allies and at our own soldiers. In 2017, after the last chemical weapon attack, Rand Paul had this to say.
Here's my problem, Stuart. If it's a one-off shot, maybe it's a $75 million, you better behave, but maybe it doesn't really have that effect. What my problem is that it may well take a lot more, and the question is, a lot more really is getting us much deeper involved into their war.
Rand Paul was in the minority of the Republican Party. Most of the Republican Party supported President Trump's missile attack at the time. And in fact, some Democrats were in agreement as well. But Senator Paul's point is well taken. Where do you draw the line? Where should we draw the line? Obviously, the use of chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction, especially on civilians, is abhorrent to civilized society and the world at large. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley had this to say to the UN Security Council yesterday.
Russia's obstructionism will not continue to hold us hostage when we are confronted with an attack like this one. The United States is determined to see the monster who dropped chemical weapons on the Syrian people held to account. You have heard what the President of the United States has said about this. Meetings are ongoing. Important decisions are being weighed even as we speak. We are on the edge of a dangerous precipice. The great evil of chemical weapons use that once unified the world in opposition is on the verge of becoming the new normal. The international community must not let this happen. We are beyond showing pictures of dead babies. We are beyond appeals to conscience. We have reached the moment when the world must see justice done. History will record this as the moment when the Security Council either discharged its duty or demonstrated its utter and complete failure to protect the people of Syria. Either way, the United States will respond.
So it seems clear that something will happen, some response will be given. The danger is that a half measure will be taken, that for some reason, Assad's regime believes that its continued use of chemical weapons is not just justified, but that somehow whatever it is that they believe they gain is more than what they stand to lose. Obviously, the condemnation of the international community is meaningless. They don't care if they are condemned. They have been condemned. They don't care about shame. They have been shamed. And they don't care about the consequences of the evil of chemical weapons. Those pictures have been shown to them. They have been broadcast on every media outlet from the United States to every corner of the world where there's a television. These things do not sway them. The Syrian government must believe that they are being protected by their allies, Iran and Russia and Hezbollah. And in a sense, they are, because the risk of a larger conflict is the primary risk that the United States must deal with. Left isolated, Assad would no longer be in power. I think that much is clear. That if he did not have the backing, first of all, if he did not have the backing of the Russian government and his allies in Turkey and Iran, even without the intervention of Israel or the United States, the rebellion would have consumed his government long ago. Assad's regime would be in the dustbin of history. But because he does have the backing of those allies, and because the risk of being drawn into not just a regional conflict, but a conflict with Russia on a much larger scale, the United States has to tread carefully. But here, as we've said, the danger is not in acting. The danger is acting in half measures. The danger was in not letting Assad fear the reprisals that could come from action. Because, to be clear, if the United States had not acted a year ago, no one would have acted. And in this instance, even with Israel attacking the T4 airbase, the threat of American reprisal may be the only thing stopping the more widespread use of chemical weapons. When Assad first began using chemical weapons, he was losing the war. He was months away from losing his grip on power. So the allure of using the weapon was coming from a mental standpoint of he's got nothing to lose. As he gets closer to winning the war, as he gets closer to solidifying his power, he has more to lose. So the idea that he would risk that doesn't make a lot of sense unless he believes that there is more to gain from the use of those weapons than there is to lose from the reprisals that will come from the United States. The options that the U.S. has are to do nothing. And in fact, Senator Rand Paul's position is one of isolationism. And Trump's base, a large portion of them, voted for him on the basis of not involving the United States on any more foreign misadventures. That being said, Trump has not been shy about the use of force in the previous case of chemical warfare perpetrated by the Syrian government. And in this instance, both his UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, who you just heard say that the United States will respond, and Trump's security advisor, Tom Bossert, and Trump himself has said nothing is off the table. The United States faces a state in Syria where Assad will most likely be in power for the foreseeable future. The forces that have been in conflict with the Assad government are more or less losing ground day by day. And Assad's government itself is being propped up by Iran and Russia and Turkey and elements of Hezbollah. An unprovoked attack on Syrian government forces would no doubt result in reprisals from Assad's allies, and that would evolve into a larger regional conflict with the potential for something much worse and much bigger. But after the chemical weapons attack on civilians, and with the signaling at the UN by Nikki Haley that the United States would respond, when the United States does respond, there has to be a goal, rather than just sending millions of dollars worth of missiles into the desert with no clearly delineated or defined goal. The goal in this case must be to inform Assad that the use of chemical weapons is unacceptable, and that its further use, whatever benefit that they imagine that they could gain from that use, would be outweighed by the consequences of such use. Because after many years of vacillating diplomacy, and except for the response from the last time Assad used chemical weapons on the civilians in Syria, there have been no real repercussions. The situation grows increasingly perilous and more dangerous as Assad is emboldened. At some point, if left unchecked, his continued use of chemical weapons poses not only a danger to his own citizens, but to the region at large. Because if Assad is emboldened and expands his use of chemical weapons, as Nikki Haley said, we run the danger of having chemical weapons becoming the new norm. That is an untenable situation, not just for the region, not just for the United States, but for the world at large. Okay, we're going to change topics. We've talked in the past about the role of government and the role of the citizenry in a democracy. We've stated that for every power and law a government passes, the citizens gain some benefit, and for that benefit, a certain amount of liberty is surrendered. When the government acts in good faith, that is a benefit to its citizens. Certain laws benefit society as a whole. When a government passes a law outlawing crimes, the citizens give up the right to commit those acts in return for the guarantee that such acts will not be committed against them without some repercussion and without some deterrence. Makes a lot of sense when you consider things such as crimes against, for instance, murder. Most citizens have no need nor desire to commit any kind of murder, so the protection afforded by the citizens against murderers is a net benefit to the citizens at large. But what happens when a law is enacted that is not done in good faith? Or in many instances where the stated purpose is one thing, but the outcome turns out to be something else. And in this particular instance, we're going to take a very close look at California's Proposition 65. Proposition 65 was passed in California by direct voter initiative in 1986. On the ballot, it was called the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986. Now, who would vote against safe drinking water? Prop 65 regulates substances officially listed by California as having a 1 in 100,000 chance of causing cancer over a 70-year period or birth defects or other reproductive harm. The first requirement of Prop 65 prohibits businesses from knowingly discharging listed substances into drinking water sources or on the land where these substances can pass into drinking water sources. So far, so good. The second part prohibits businesses from knowingly exposing individuals to listed substances without providing a clear and reasonable warning. That seems okay on its surface. But what does that list look like? As of now, there are some 1,000 or close to 1,000 substances listed. And if there's any expectation that someone could be exposed to it, you have to put the Prop 65 warning. Now, it's almost universal in California. You can't go anywhere without seeing it. There is, in fact, a Prop 65 warning in Disneyland that says the Disneyland Resort contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer and birth defects or other reproductive harm. Where? Disneyland is huge. Now, if they said you could get ear cancer from going on It's a Small World one more time, that might at least be something. And that's just the problem. Because the penalties for abuse can be so severe, and there's no penalty for posting an unnecessary warning sign, the signs go up everywhere. They are on goods, they are outside gas stations, they are in parking garages, hotels. And because they have been made ubiquitous, they're no longer serving their intended purpose. Nobody is being warned any longer of anything because people no longer pay any attention to them because they're everywhere. And in fact, even if you don't live in California, goods coming into California that might contain any of the prohibited chemicals or substances have to have that warning. And in fact, if you are producing goods in California, they have to have that warning, even if you end up exporting those goods to other states. So even if you don't live in California, you probably have seen a Prop 65 warning. But that isn't the worst part of it. A business found to be in violation of Prop 65 is subject to civil penalties of up to $2,500 per day for each violation. Did you catch that? That's a civil penalty. It's not a criminal penalty. And while lawsuits may be brought by the California Attorney General or any district attorney or any city attorney, it can be brought by private citizens. Prop 65 contains a citizen suit provision in its enforcement policy. That allows trial lawyers to create strawman plaintiffs and rake in millions of dollars from businesses who unknowingly or knowingly fail to meet all of Prop 65's requirements. So how much money are we talking about? Since 2000, private citizens, or that is to say private law firms, have raked in over $300 million from California businesses. And of that $300 million, a whopping $200 million go directly to the lawyers. There are multiple law firms, all bounty hunting for these Prop 65 lawsuits. It's a bonanza for private lawyers. The bottom line is that your children are going to die. That was Whoopi Goldberg warning a San Diego neighborhood in 1986 when the proponents of Prop 65 were in full swing. Jane Fonda said, quote, "I want to be able to drink the water without risking my life or the life of my children." That nonstop fear-mongering got the public to approve the measure by a margin of almost 2-1. And the end result of that is there are signs everywhere, and people are no safer for it, but California businesses and the consumers that patronize them have paid a heavy, heavy toll. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, after reviewing more than 1,000 human and animal studies, stated in 2016 that it found no conclusive evidence for a carcinogenic effect of drinking coffee. A 2017 review found that a daily cup of coffee is associated with a reduced risk of liver cancer and endometrial cancer. A 2018 study found that coffee was associated with lowered risk of death after being diagnosed with colorectal cancer. And another 2018 analysis found that drinking 4 cups of coffee a day was associated with a lower risk of postmenopausal breast cancer. And yet, in 2008, California coffee purveyors were sued because when coffee is roasted, tiny amounts of acrylamide is formed. Acrylamide is on California's Prop 65 list. And recently, a judge ruled that because the onus is on the coffee makers to prove that acrylamide is not harmful in those amounts, that they were in violation of Prop 65. One of those coffee makers, 7-Eleven, has already settled out of court, paying the trial attorneys close to $1 million. California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment determines what the no significant risk levels for carcinogens and the maximum allowable dose levels are for the chemicals causing reproductive toxicity. These so-called safe harbor levels only exist, however, for roughly 300 of the 1,000 chemicals. But even if the substances are on the safe harbor list, it is up to the business to prove during the course of the lawsuit that the end user is not exposed to any more than those limits. And that can be extremely difficult or outright impossible. And in the cases where it can be proved, the testimony of expert witnesses and testing far outweigh in cost what the plaintiffs typically seek in a settlement. And that's the plan. That's the whole idea. They want to settle. They don't necessarily want to take on an entire trial jury because they want to move on to the next victim. A plaintiff can bring a Prop 65 lawsuit if they can demonstrate exposure to any amount of a listed chemical in a product, no matter how small. And all they need to do is show that there is some exposure to a listed chemical in a product with no warning, and then the burden falls on the defendant to prove that the amount or chemical is below the safe harbor level, or if there isn't one stated, they are basically stuck with paying the fine. Attempts to reform the law have been met with limited success. There were attempts in the state legislature in California to give businesses a 2-week grace period upon notification. That was killed in committee. Now the Prop 65 requirements have been updated. The warning before used to say, warning, this product contains a chemical known to the state of California to cause cancer. The new warning comes with a bigger triangle. It's the exclamation mark in the triangle. The warning must be bolded and now has the language that says, this product can expose you to chemicals including acrylamide, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer. There are also new requirements for internet warnings. There are also new requirements for language translations, the gist of which is all to place a greater burden on the businesses, with the end result being that now there are more pitfalls and more cause for them to be sued and have to settle out of court. You don't have to use those warnings, of course. The law states that you can use any language that is, quote, clear and reasonable, and then gives no definition of such, so that doing so is rife with potential consequences. Bounty hunters have filed hundreds of claims a year. The average number of settled claims since 2012 has been 500 settlements a year. California is not unique in its overreach. There are many states with similarly ridiculous laws on the books, and the federal government is not immune. Anytime a government proposes a law and it comes before its citizens, underpinned not with rational thought, but with exhortations to emotional appeals. This is the danger that is run. And now, of course, this law is 30 years old, and it's not going anywhere. Any attempts now to change its purpose or change its course will be likely met with some of those 300 million mis-earned dollars being put back into the lobbying system to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Now it is in the possession of self-interested parties. The government itself is necessary, and it doesn't need to work against its citizens. But once again, we have an example of making sure that when we make that trade, that when a law is being proposed, that we understand the ramifications, and that liberty once sold is bought back exceptionally dearly. That is, if it is available to be bought back at all. And now on to a little bit more whimsical news. Tasmanian devils are unique to the island of Tasmania off the coast of Australia. They are endangered. And one of the reasons that they are endangered is they have one of the very few cases in known science of transmissible cancer. Tasmanian devils themselves are genetically pretty similar to one another, and unfortunately that means that cancer cells are able to thrive and spread from one devil to another. And because Tasmanian devils being what they are, when they greet each other, they like to bite each other in the face. And unfortunately, that's how they're spreading cancer amongst their population. The population is heavily riddled with this cancer. And because it is a relatively small island and the population is homogeneous, it's likely that left to its own devices, these critters will end up dying out because of this cancer. Now, in some good news, the method by which the cancer spreads, and this particular type of cancer, is treatable by a drug that was originally designed for humans. And in the lab, the drug has successfully halted the growth of the Tasmanian cancer cells. So here we have a case of human testing working out well for the animals. After all, the animal testing for humans, I guess we owed them one. If you found this program entertaining, informative, or interesting, please subscribe. Please leave a review on iTunes or SoundCloud. It all helps. If you'd like to reach us, send us a note at podcast@civilmoment.com. Follow us on Facebook and share our posts. Follow us on Twitter and retweet our tweets. We could not do this without your continued support. We are a relatively new podcast, and listenership is huge for us as well as interaction. If you have any comments or questions, visit us at www.civilmoment.com. Give us a mention on your podcast or your blog. And until next time, thank you. This is Vong, and this has been A Civil Moment. The Civil Moment Podcast, copyright 2018, Phase Final Incorporated.